Part 2.
Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to even use. As he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this very moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wild flowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and he leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness.
What is the matter?
Matter with you? Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast, Aunt Sponge ordered. Oh, Auntie Sponge, James cried out, and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all, please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely. Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute, Aunt Spiker shouted. Beat him, cried Aunt Sponge. I certainly will, Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with his large, frightened eyes. Well, I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot, she said. And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm. Oops. And give me some peace. James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden, and he hid himself behind that clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands, and he began to cry and cry. It was at this point that the first thing of all the rather peculiar things that led to so many much more peculiar things happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned around and he saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a rather very small man and an old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James.
When he spoke, his
voice was very slow and creaky. Come closer, little boy, he said, beckoning to James with a finger. Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful. James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into the pocket of his jacket, and he took out a small white bag. You see this? He whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. You know what this is, my dear? Do you know what's inside this little bag? Then he came nearer still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel the air blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale, mildeweed like air in an old cellar. Take a look, my dear, he said, opening the bag, and he tilted it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny little green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. Listen to them, the old man whispered. Listen to them move. James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming up from inside it. And then he noticed that all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very, very slowly stirring about and moving over each other as if they were alive. There's more power and magic in those things, in this bag, than in all the rest of the world put together, the old man said softly. But what are they? James murmured, finding his voice at last. Where did they come from? Aha, the old man whispered. You'd never guess that. He was crouching now a little and pushing his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the top of James's forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and he began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues!" he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues bottled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights, with the eyeballs of a lizard. Add the fingers of a young monkey, the gizzard of a pig, the beak of a green parrot, the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week, and then let the moon do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper bag into James's hand and said, "Here, you take it. It's yours."
James Henry Trotter
Stood there clutching the bag and staring at the old man. "And now," the old man said, "all you've got to do is this. Take a large jug of water and pour all these little green things into it. Then very, very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head. That sets them off. It gets them going, and in a couple of minutes the water will begin to froth and bubble furiously, and as soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful, in one big gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start coming out of your mouth, and immediately after that, marvelous things will start happening to you. Fabulous, unbelievable things, and you will never, ever be miserable again in your life. Because you are miserable, aren't you, James? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now off you go, and do exactly as I say. And don't whisper a word of this to those 2 horrible aunts of yours. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either. Because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon something else instead of upon you. And that isn't what you want at all, is it, my dear? Whatever they meet first, be it a bug, an insect, animal, or tree, that will be the one who gets the full power of that magic. So hold the bag tight. Don't tear the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time. Go. Hurry. And with that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. And that's part 2.